So, a few years ago, when I was still a relatively youthful 33-year-old, I made a somewhat personal video reflecting on some thoughts about getting older. I am now 37 years old, and I thought I would do a follow-up video just because this continues to be a subject that interests me quite a bit. Getting older can obviously be scary because it's a reminder of your own mortality, but I have found one of the best ways to manage that anxiety is just being self-reflective and mindful about the whole thing as an experience. Aging can be both pleasant and painful, but it is also a fascinating journey of constant learning and surprise, given it is the one aspect of life you will never be fully prepared for. So here are a few more reflections on life from someone in their late 30s. Your 30s are a weird age because it's the first time in your life when you kind of officially stop getting praised for being young whenever you accomplish something. A teenager who does anything impressive is considered heroic for being young, same with someone in their 20s. But by the time you're in your 30s, and certainly your late 30s, well, you're pretty unambiguously in adult territory, and nothing you do is automatically impressive anymore, since expectations for what a grown-up should be capable of doing are far higher at this point. I'm somebody that used to be pretty precocious as a kid, and I got a lot of praise for being an impressive young person. But these days, whenever an older person praises me for being so young, it can come off as quite condescending or even dishonest. It can even reflect badly on the speaker, making them seem like some aging boomer who's lost all perspective on time. But while it is not fun to lose that persona of youthful vigor, it can also be quite liberating to be freed from having all of your accomplishments judged through the prism of age. Like, by the time you're in your late 30s and someone is impressed with something you've done, it's satisfying when their compliments aren't always followed by a "for someone your age." A bigger thing that has affected me more than I expected has been a growing awareness of myself in my 20s as like a distinct person. When you're young, I think you tend to broadly think of life as being split into 3 phases: kid, teen, and adult, and maybe old person somewhere way down the line. But as I get closer to the end of the 3rd decade of my life, I find that I am starting to regard JJ in his 20s as this very distinct and separate person too, almost as distinct as teenage JJ. A while ago, I stumbled across this picture, which is a photo of me with some of my friends at some sort of house party when I was in college. I would estimate this photo has got to be at least 12 years old, and it was kind of striking to me just how distant I felt from the JJ seen here. I'm not really close with these guys anymore, both of whom are now married with children and off doing their own thing. And I don't really go to random house parties anymore either, where people just stand around in the backyard drinking either. So the whole picture just seems like such a snippet of a lifestyle that's so far removed from the life I have now. I also cringe a bit when I think of the sort of conversations that me and my friends would probably be having back then. The kind of ignorant yet supremely self-confident debates about politics and romance and stuff at a time when we were all just still sheltered undergraduates with so many gaps of knowledge and life experience necessary to flesh out our worldview. The other thing I notice is just how young I look here. Like, my hair and skin look healthier and smoother, and my body looks thinner and leaner. Now, I know that I probably don't look that dramatically different, given I still have lots of hair and I haven't gained much weight. But this whole concept of being aware of yourself in your 20s as a physically different person is something that I think starts to strike you a lot in your 30s, just because it is somewhat unexpected. Like, we expect our teenage selves to look a lot different from our kid selves, and our 20-year-old adult selves to look different from ourselves as teenagers. But noticing how much you physically changed from your 20s to your 30s can be more surprising or upsetting, because I think the natural tendency is to kind of obliviously assume that you finished physically aging once you become an adult. Obviously, we all know that really old people are all decayed and wizened, but we often underestimate the degree we arrive at that state gradually, but observably through every decade of life. You don't just magically wake up looking like an 80-year-old one day. I definitely have some people in my life for whom the decline of their physical appearance has become a very pressing anxiety in recent years. Along with things like hair loss or graying hair, a lot of young men tend to noticeably gain a lot of weight in their late 20s and early 30s. This is frequently blamed on some sort of vague, pseudo-scientific theory of their metabolism changing, but in reality, it often has more to do with the fact that men just often develop bad lifestyle habits at this age. Even if their diet doesn't change much, they often become noticeably less active, with a lot less time spent walking or running around and doing stuff, in part because their lives become more dominated by work or their families, which exhausts or depresses them and drains a lot of their time and energy for other things. An interesting thing that I've noticed in my own peer group is men complaining about muscle loss in particular. Men of my generation were some of the first to grow up at a time where having a certain kind of muscular physique was considered really cool, and a lot of guys did achieve this look when they were in their 20s. But having a body like that can fade surprisingly quickly if you're not careful. And in your 30s, I've started to notice this phenomenon of guys being all nostalgic about how they used to be really jacked and have great abs or whatever, but are now just soft and overweight. And this obviously starts to take a toll on their self-esteem and self-confidence, particularly as it relates to their interactions with women, or men, as the case may be. I'm focusing on male anxieties about appearance here, just because I'm more familiar with their side of things. I'm sure it must be worse for women, especially single women, just because obviously our society places a higher premium on women looking young and thin and pretty, with the standards of looking old or unattractive much more unforgiving for females. Okay, so this is getting kind of upsetting. So let me now segue into some more upbeat reflections. Staying on the topic of physicality, one thing that has been interesting to notice is how the sort of people you are attracted to changes over time. I can remember being in my early 20s and worrying that I was going to grow up to be some creepy old man just because I felt like I would always be attracted to young guys in their 20s. But in my experience at least, as you get older, your romantic interest in physically attractive young people does start to become more tempered by a more nuanced understanding of what young people are actually like. So it's like, yes, this person in their early 20s might be superficially attractive, but they are also probably quite immature in a lot of ways and in a very different phase of life than you are, which in turn means that it might be hard to foster a genuine romantic connection with them based on mutual respect and understanding and other important compatibility metrics of that sort, particularly once you start dating with a greater sense of purpose to find a long-term partner. Someone's looks do start to shift in relative importance to other things. To be sure, I am not saying that you somehow stop caring about looks as you get older. I mean, we are all humans here. But people who are young and attractive do become less interesting to you as the young part starts to turn you off as much as the attractive part might turn you on. Now that might sound a little bit judgmental to the youngs, so let me now tell you another part of aging that I have enjoyed, and that is developing new styles of relationships with younger adults. When I was a teenager, I had a sort of mentor type relationship with this guy who was in his late 30s or so. I had been introduced to him through one of my teachers, and he was a professional cartoonist who worked at the big Electronic Arts headquarters here in Vancouver. I would go to visit him at his studio, or he would take me to his work, and he taught me all about the cartooning industry, which was something I was very into at that time. I remember he once took me to see a lecture by the great cartoonist Art Spiegelman, which was really amazing to young JJ, because smart adults giving sophisticated talks was not the sort of thing I had been exposed to before. I don't really remember for how many years I hung out with this guy before I got too busy with college and he got more preoccupied with his young family, but his mentorship had a big impact on me, and it's still something I reflect on a lot. And it was very much a product of the age gap between us, this idea that he was confident being the older person who had stuff to teach, and I was comfortable being the younger man who could look up to and learn from him. And now, as I get older, and dare I say, more successful, I am finding myself more interested in playing that same sort of mentor role to others. I find myself becoming more interested in sharing what I've learned with younger people, be it in the realm of journalism or YouTube or even just life, and I in turn find that younger people are more inclined to look up to me. To be sure, this can feel kind of awkward or even stressful at times because it can be psychologically difficult to imagine yourself as some sort of wise elder when you've spent so much of your life thinking of yourself as the young and naive one. And that can lead to a lot of self-consciousness and self-doubt, where you're like, oh, am I being arrogant or even creepy for trying to take an interest in people younger than me? But once you get past all of that, it can also be incredibly rewarding once you start to feel confident enough that you've lived enough life to be able to share some of your findings with the next generation. Which gets into the final observation I want to make about aging, which is growing appreciation for wisdom. I do feel like most people's personalities tend to basically solidify in their mid-20s or so. I remember a while back I had this job where I occasionally had to deal with my town's city council, and I was surprised how much these important men and women in their 50s and 60s behaved basically just like college kids in their 20s, just in terms of their capacity for drama and stupidity and all the rest. So getting older doesn't necessarily correlate with getting smarter or even more mature, in the sense of growing more stern or serious. But I think it does correlate with getting wiser, with wisdom being one of those concepts that's sort of hard to objectively define, but does get easier to appreciate as time goes on. I guess I would define wisdom as a sort of mental state in which the world around you starts to seem a bit more predictable and a bit less intimidating, which in turn makes you more comfortable identifying and analyzing stuff within it. So for instance, you gain more confidence in your ability to distinguish a truly important event from something not worth getting too agitated about, or an opportunity from a scam, or a person of strong character from someone weak and superficial. These are the sort of abstract values that you can only really ever learn from experience because they're informed by a lifetime of observation. At worst, this sort of wisdom can make you more smug and close-minded as you get older. This idea that you've seen it all and therefore can be more arrogant and judgmental in a sort of stereotypically stubborn old person way. But at best, it does start to make getting older feel more rewarding, which starts to take a bit of the edge off your nostalgia for your lost youth. And it's why, at some point, every time somebody asks you, would you ever want to be young again, they always have to add the stipulation, but you would know what you know now. Because otherwise, anyone over 25 would just always answer no. You can be sentimental for what has happened in the past, but at some point you never want to go back. So I'm not sure what my discussion question for this video would be. I know a lot of you are younger than I am, so you might not be able to fully relate to some of what I had to say today. In fact, this video was heavily motivated by the sort of mentoring the young attitude I described earlier. One thing I would be curious about is if any of you guys have ever had a sort of mentor type relationship with an older person who wasn't a relative, and in what way you found that helpful. And of course, if I said anything that did ring true to you, or if you have any observations about aging of your own that you would like to add, I would obviously like to hear those too. See you all next week.